Amanda from Ponte's Books here with another video on The Prince and the Pauper, this time focusing on chapter 3, and our vocabulary focus for this time is a little bit different than the other previous two. So previously I had focused on one word for each chapter, 1 and 2, that came up throughout the rest of the book quite a bit. And I'm still focusing on words that come up quite a bit, but instead of focusing on one word, I'm focusing on a collection of words that really all go together. So those words are thou, thee, thy, thine, thyself, and ye. And it might seem like one of those doesn't fit in, but I promise it does. So if you are familiar with these words, you understand why they all go together. If you're not, then hopefully you learn a little something from this video. So these words basically are all versions of the word you. So you can see my Garfield picture here. He's pointing at you because that helps us with the meaning of these words. So here's where my nerdy grammar side is going to come out a little bit. If we look at the words as they were used in Tudor English, which isn't really a thing, but that is the time period where this story takes place, is in Tudor England. So Tudor time English, thou, thee, thy, thine, thyself, ye, those are those words that we're focusing in on. Then in that middle column, you'll see a translation to what we use modern day. You, your, yours, yourself, you all. And then the last column gives a description of kind of like, what do we call that? So all of these words have something in common, and that is that they are all pronouns. So if you're not familiar with a pronoun is a word that can take the place of a noun or nouns. So like I could call myself Amanda, or I could replace that with I or me. And those are pronouns that I can use to replace my name with. Or if I'm talking to a person, I can use their name, or I could say you. So when we're talking to a person, we call that talking in second person. I and me, that was first person. He, she, they, that's third person. So when we're talking in second person, nowadays we use you. But back then, we would use some of those different forms. So we'll just take a look at them one at a time. We'll actually look at the first two together because they go together pretty well. So we have thou and we have thee. So those are both words that modern day we have substituted with the word you. And if you look at the description, the difference is one is a subjective or nominative singular, and the other is objective singular. So singular means we're talking to one person. So you is only one person that I'm talking to. And subjective or nominative really just means that it is the subject of the sentence. And objective means it is the object of a sentence. So it comes after a verb. It's a direct object or an indirect object, or it comes after a preposition. It's an object of the preposition. Typically, it means objective is later in the sentence, subjective is earlier in the sentence. So this is hard for us to picture now because we use the word you for both of these things, but think about the words I and me. There are certain instances where you would use the word I and some where you would use the word me. So you would say, I went to the store. You wouldn't say me went to the store. And that's because it's in subjective pronoun. And in this case, it's toward the beginning of the sentence. And so we choose to use I. In the same way, if it's earlier in the sentence or the subject of the sentence, we would use thou. And if it's later in the sentence, we would use thee, just like how we would use me. So you could say, he bought a present for me. You wouldn't say for I, because it's an object of the preposition, comes later in the sentence. So in the same way, you could say, I bought a present for thee. You wouldn't say for thou, you would say for thee, because it's an objective pronoun. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. That's a really quick breeze through some heavy grammar topics there. So then we have thy and thine. Those are a little bit more straightforward. The only difference between those being, and this is the same way that we use your and yours, your always comes before something. There's always a noun that comes after it that it's describing because it's acting like an adjective. So it's a possessive pronoun, but it's acting like an adjective. Yours is a possessive pronoun that doesn't need to have anything that come after it. So you could say, I bought your present, or you could say the present is yours. You wouldn't say yours present, or you wouldn't say the present is your, right? You have to use the correct one in the right circumstances. So that's the same thing with thy and thine. I bought thy present instead of I bought your present, or the present is yours, the present is thine. So those words can, again, substitute pretty much 100% of the time, but they're just used in slightly different ways. So then we have thyself and yourself, which are considered reflexive pronouns. So that would be like you can get a present for yourself. So it is just acting as kind of a standalone noun, in this case, again, an object of the preposition, buy a present for thyself. So those can substitute, again, almost 100% of the time. Can't really think of any circumstances where they wouldn't. And then lastly, ye is actually the plural form. So that means when you're talking to more than one person. So it's like you all. And fun fact, and we'll talk about this in just a minute, the plural form of the objective form of you all was actually you. So that one is the only one that was the same. So you will see the word you still come up when you're looking at English spoken in these tutor times, but you'll also see all of these other ones as well. So this was all very confusing, and over time it kind of got simplified, which I'm not mad about because it's very complicated. So if we look at the word history a little bit here, why did we stop using the word thou? Like, why did we move away from this language? So originally thee and thou were Old English for second person singular. So that's what we kind of just talked about in that previous chart. And then ye and you were used for second person plural. So again, the difference between those two things, second person singular, I'm talking to one person, second person plural, I'm talking to a group of people. So then you and your actually started being used to refer to people of higher social standing than you. So the language started changing and they started using these words in a different way. So like your majesty, right, is a way that you would refer to oftentimes a king who is always above you unless you were also a king, or somebody who's a social equal to you. And thou was more reserved for people of lower social standing or just in a casual, friendly way. So because that shift started happening, the words started being used in a different way, and some of those words started being dropped from what people were saying. So in particular, many people who are Quakers, so if you're not familiar with Quakers, so that was a religious group that started in England, they believed that the word you was actually inappropriate to use. And actually one of the Quakers wrote a whole book on this called A Battledore for Teachers and Professors to Learn Singular and Plural, you to many and thou to one, singular to one, thou, plural, many, you. That's a complicated book. And it's over 200 pages long. So he had a lot to say on the subject. And it got to some point where some people were even beaten or abused for using the word you. So again, that's not necessarily related to why we stopped using these words, but it's just kind of like a fun fact. And yeah, so over time, we started dropping it because thou was seen as something you would use for someone who was lesser. And I guess that started being seen as rude eventually. So we moved away from it. So it's a fun article to read. So looking at some sentences, the original sentence, if thine enemy wrong thee, buy each of his children a drum. So that's actually a proverb. That might be why it seems kind of strange. So I purposely chose this one because it has two different examples of the words. If thine enemy, remember that's if your enemy, and wrong thee, that is one of the forms of you. So you can see I kind of translated it below. If your enemy wrongs you, so does something wrong to you, buy each of his children a drum. And then if we look at an actual sentence from the chapter, so again, there are many times where these words come up, including even in just chapter 3, but mind thy manners, thou young beggar. So mind your manners, you young beggar, is kind of a way to translate that. So it's actually pretty easy to translate, easier than some of the other words that come up. But wait, there's more. So if we think about this word thou or all the other forms of it, there are some different meanings that we can kind of modern day attribute to this. So for these modern day references, the first one is holier than thou. So that's a modern day kind of term that uses the word thou in it. So it's really used to describe somebody who has a holier than thou attitude. That's the way that you usually hear it used. And so it kind of means like it's a better than you attitude that they have. So they act holier than thou. Then our second example is kind of cheating because Shakespeare uses thou all the time, but this is a pretty famous quote by Shakespeare that includes the word thou. Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? And actually the trickier word in this quote is the word wherefore, which actually means why and not where. So it's really Romeo, Romeo, why are you Romeo? But that is a topic to get into another day. But again, that. Then there's fare thee well, which is a term that can kind of mean like, you know, goodbye, like good travels, but it also is something that means something that is done to the utmost extent or to perfection. So the research was done to a fare thee well. So it's done to perfection. Then there's a phrase that people use sometimes to show how much of a certain attribute somebody has. Blank, thy name is blank. So if you're trying to show like someone named Jason is really arrogant, you're like, arrogance, thy name is Jason. So that's just a phrase that's sometimes thrown out there. Also, a lot of religious texts or songs. So that could include like holiday songs, and things like that. You'll still hear that language of thee, thy, thou stuff in the lyrics. And then kind of just referencing these pictures that are here, ye shall know the truth. That was on the library at the University of Texas. And there's a Dear America book that's referenced there called Love Thy Neighbor. There was a pretty famous movie called Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? So you see these words come up kind of all the time in just different references, books, movies, TV shows, sayings. So I wanted to highlight a few of them, but that's by no means it. So that's it for today.